Just tell us why it happened. What happened? Why did you and your husband?
What is in his mind?
We were sent here to basically talk to you and get your side of the story, okay?
The attacker ran up, took the shot, and ran away.
It was somebody executing somebody in the street.
Who in the world would have a motive to take this woman and gun her down, basically in broad daylight? Some things are huge, screaming clues, but you put the circumstantial evidence together, and ultimately, it's a very compelling story about the involvement of both of them in this homicide.
You have people that sit around and talk to each other, and they get in their own world, and they get crazy. And they come up with these schemes.
We're done. Seriously, we're done with you. You're gonna go down as this cold-blooded person.
They were together on this. They cooked this thing up together.
I just hope she don't blame this thing on you.
There are many things I would like to say. And let me give you the truth. You don't have the truth.
October 12, 2013, 7:45 a.m. Montgomery County 911 dispatchers receive a flurry of calls from the D.C. suburb of Germantown, Maryland.
Montgomery County 911, what is your emergency?
Someone just got shot. Someone was just shot right here on Crystal Rock Drive in Germantown, Maryland.
Crystal Rock Drive is a residential street, and there's a lot of traffic that's there.
What happened?
I don't know. We just heard shots, and I see a lady in the middle of the street.
Did you see who shot her?
No, I just rolled up.
There was a woman that was seen by a variety of callers. She was walking down the street when 3 shots rang out.
First responders raced to the scene.
When they got there, they found a woman who was in her 40s down on the ground. She was severely injured. She was unconscious. She was not responsive to any of the officers.
The injuries was a gunshot wound to the chest, a gunshot wound to the abdomen, and a gunshot wound to the back.
And so authorities, rush her to the hospital.
As the ambulance clears out, officers get to work processing the chaotic scene.
On the ground, they see some of her personal effects, which includes her clothing, her purse, etc., that were out there.
There were no shell casings, which led us to believe that a revolver was used.
Going into her purse, they find some identification. Within the identification, they come up with a name and an address.
She is Preeta Gaba, 49 years old woman, and she lives near the area where she's been shot.
Police head to Preeta's apartment to notify her family about the shooting and are greeted by her 22-year-old son, Lim Gaba.
He confirmed that Preeta lived with him at the apartment complex, and then the officers informed him that she had been shot and transported to Shady Grove Hospital.
Her son, of course, is shocked that his mom has been shot right down the street.
You're talking there with Lim, her son. You're trying to find out, who is this woman? Where is she from?
49-year-old Preeta Gaba wanted nothing more than to build a strong family.
She was born in the mid-60s, raised in an orphanage in India, and she managed to, as a woman, she got married to a man. They had a child. Tragically, her husband died when the boy was about 9 years old, and it was obviously rough for them.
So now she is a single parent, raising her son Lim.
She was an excellent mother, like total, for her son. Her son was all her world. And they have very good relationship.
Still, Preeta's hopes of a solid family life did not feel complete without a father figure for her son. And in 1999, she met Baldeo Taneja.
She met him through an internet website, a dating site. Matrimonial websites are pretty common, actually, in India. She wanted to have a life partner.
Baldeo was very intelligent. He was a PhD in biostatistics, very generous, down to earth, very jolly, and very sincere, very helpful.
She's alone with a young son to take care of, and then she meets a successful man, and they fall in love, they get married.
In 2007, 5 years into their marriage, Preeta's happily ever after was hit by a harsh reality.
They had an Amway business in India. It wasn't succeeding to the extent that they wanted it to. It wasn't making enough money. So her husband, he had a PhD, came to the United States in search of employment, and he was able to find employment in Boston.
He goes, look, let me get over there, get established, and I will send some money, and I'll bring you and Lim to the United States. Well, that doesn't happen.
He kept making excuses and putting it off, and eventually she just got on the plane and came anyway. He had an apartment, and he put her into a motel, and she was a little offended. She was there for 2 weeks. Eventually, she discovered that he was in a relationship with another woman. So she went back to India.
Devastated, Preeta was left to pick up the pieces in India, but still she had her heart set on a life in America. In 2009, she moved to Germantown, Maryland with her 18-year-old son, Lim.
Preeta was my employee. We used to have a moving company, and she worked for me like 4 years. She answered the phone and booked clients, and she was excellent. She was the best employee I have. The dream was her son go to college and graduate, and she looking to buy a house, and she started working on it.
I met Preeta in 2010. She came to my office. She explained to me what had happened, and we filed a petition for divorce. She had plans for the future. She wanted to go to Montgomery College and take some courses so that she could make more money. And after the divorce in 2011, she was quite happy, and she was doing well.
Just 4 years after immigrating to the United States, Preeta is fighting for her life in the hospital after being shot 3 times in broad daylight. And Montgomery County police officers are meeting with her son, 22-year-old Lim, to try to piece together what may have happened.
Preeta doesn't have any enemies in the community, and she's a person that just wakes up in the morning, goes to work, and comes home.
You're trying to find out who else are significant people in her life. Lim, her son, begins to tell their family story. My dad died when I was 10. My mom married this guy, Baldeo Taneja.
Lim says at this point, Baldeo lives in Nashville, which is 600 miles away, and detectives think probably he's not a suspect. They ask, was there some other man in her life?
And that's where we learned that she was dating a gentleman in the Germantown area.
Lim said his mother didn't tell him a whole lot about this boyfriend, but that his stepfather told him, don't trust the boyfriend, he was a bad guy. So the detectives are interested in finding this boyfriend.
Were they having any problems in their relationship?
Coming up, as the suspect list grows, investigators begin to key in on a dangerous duo.
There were witnesses that a woman shot her.
What's the relationship been like?
They do not talk or nothing. No contact, nothing.
They didn't want to have anything to do with it.
These are people who are, I would just say, evil.
In Germantown, Maryland, 22-year-old Lim Gaba has just arrived at the hospital after his mother, 49-year-old Prita Gaba, has been shot down in her neighborhood.
Lim was in the waiting room, hoping that he was going to get an opportunity to speak to her.
Tragically, Prita's son discovers he's already too late.
The shooting was at 7:30 in the morning. We got notified at about 9 a.m. that his mother had died. It's sad. He lives with his mother by himself. When he was notified that she had passed away, it's like he lost his whole world.
We was shocked. All our family was shocked from that. You know, we took it very hard. She was a very nice person. It didn't cross my mind something like this can happen to her.
Homicide detectives immediately set out to solve who would do this to Prita. They start by re-examining the statement Prita's son Lim provided to officers earlier that morning.
Of course, anytime you have something like this, the first person that the police look at is the boyfriend or the husband or somebody like that.
After officers talked to Lim, we learned that Prita had a boyfriend, and we had to learn about him.
So the boyfriend was the first suspect that the police focused in on because he was here locally.
Detectives assign officers to locate Prita's boyfriend.
He was at work. He's a mattress salesman.
They ask him what he knows about what's going on. You know, where were you at 7:30 in the morning when she's gunned down in the street? And he basically provided what turned out to be an airtight alibi.
At the time of the shooting, he was at work and he was not near the homicide scene.
He was devastated and visibly shaken by the news that Prita had been killed. And the information could be confirmed by the police. He was very quickly eliminated as a suspect. He had absolutely nothing to do with the case.
Later that day, detectives attend Prita's autopsy.
Prita was transported to the medical examiner's office in Baltimore.
She was shot 3 times, and those shots were center mass.
So this was clearly a targeted shooting. It was about killing somebody.
We went through her clothing and we discovered a projectile that was in her shirt. And that projectile was consistent with a .38 caliber round. So we knew we were looking for either a .357 revolver or a .38, because a .357 revolver can also shoot 38 rounds.
Once the autopsy is complete, detectives return to the scene and interview witnesses to find out what other information they may have.
Police found one woman. She heard the shots.
There were witnesses that a woman shot her and that the woman ran away.
There didn't appear to be any conversation between her and the attacker. The attacker ran up, took the shots, and ran away.
They observed a female running from the scene, described with an orange scarf.
Prita's about 5'3", and they described the shooter as about the same height, the skin tone roughly the same. Also, the shooter appeared to have some injury to her leg or foot, and so described her as, quote, limping away from the crime scene. Who in the world would have a motive to take this woman, run up and gun her down, basically in broad daylight? So you go back, focusing on Prita and her life and people that she had been involved in.
Investigators next reach out to Prita's ex-husband, Baldeo Taneja, to see if he has any valuable knowledge about Prita's life or death.
He's 600 miles away in Nashville. And detectives start asking about who might have killed his ex-wife.
Baldeo is a statistician. He teaches college courses.
And he begins to tell the story. You ought to be looking at this crazy former student of me. She's like obsessed with me. And she loves me, and she's made threats to do violence.
Baldeo admits the two had an affair years ago, but they are no longer in contact.
He tells detectives that she was angry about his being married to Prita at the time, and perhaps she was a suspect. Again, the shooter, according to witnesses, was not a man, but in fact, a woman. So detectives are interested in finding out about her.
Baldeo Taneja has offered investigators a potential lead for who shot and killed his ex-wife, 49-year-old Prita Gaba, a former student who he had an affair with years prior.
I was able to learn that this woman lived in the Boston area. Detective Reuben and I traveled to Boston and met her and explained to her the investigation and explained that she was basically being accused of committing this homicide.
The young woman is quick to set the record straight.
She said it was just the other way around. She was not obsessed with him. He was obsessed with her. Also, this student had an airtight alibi and was nowhere near Maryland.
At the time of the homicide, she was at a festival in North Carolina, and she had on her phone checked in on Facebook showing that she wasn't in the area.
She literally could not have done it and had nothing to do with it.
Knowing that Baldeo led them to a dead end, investigators start to question his involvement in his ex-wife's death. They contact Prita's son and her divorce attorney to learn more about her relationship with Baldeo.
At the time of the homicide, they were divorced, and Baldeo is remarried to Raminder Kaur. Since the divorce, I guess, approximately 2 years ago, what's the relationship been like?
They do not talk or nothing. I don't contact nothing.
Recently, however, Prita had been forced to make contact with Baldeo once again.
After the divorce, she was entitled to 3 years of alimony. After about a year and a half, Dr. Taneja just stopped paying alimony.
Okay, how much was the alimony supposed to be?
I think it's 2,400, something like that.
A month?
Yes, so I know they had a court date recently on October 10th because she didn't get paid for like 3 months or something like that.
Okay, so 3 months, you talking about a little close to 10 grand?
Yes, and he didn't show up. His lawyer said that he's still in Tennessee and they just asked for more time to pay that alimony.
He was very upset with the amount of alimony that he had to pay, and it was very clear that there was some animosity between the victim, Prita, and her former husband, Baldeo. Now, he becomes more of a suspect. He's got a motive.
We ran his driver's license, which gave us an address in Nashville, Tennessee. And in Tennessee, if you have a handgun permit, that's recorded on your motor vehicle driver's license, and we learned that he has a permit to carry a gun. And so we started to do research to see if Baldeo had purchased any guns, and we learned that he had purchased 2 revolvers 2 weeks earlier.
And one of those weapons matches the same caliber as the gun that was used to kill Prita.
And once we had learned that, he became our #1 suspect. He's our guy. But after the shooting, the description was of a female doing the shooting and running away.
Baldeo lived down in Nashville, Tennessee, with his new wife, who he married after he had divorced the victim in this case.
Raminder Kaur was an Indian immigrant, and she worked with him.
She fit the overall description of the person who was identified as the shooter.
And so that's when we decided that we're going to need to go to Tennessee. We made notification to Nashville Police Department to let them know that we were coming, and we landed in Nashville very early in the morning. We went to the neighborhood where Baldeo lives, and it's a townhouse community with one way in, one way out. And we were able to see that his car was sitting in front of his residence.
Investigators spot Baldeo and Raminder exiting their home and driving off in the vehicle.
At that point, myself and 2 detectives followed the vehicle, and we approach a traffic light, and Nashville City Police are at the front of the light. The suspects are behind them, and then we're behind the suspects, so they're sandwiched in. A decision was made to arrest Baldeo and Raminder right there on the street.
They also noticed that Raminder walks with a limp, which had been one of the clues that they'd heard from a witness in Montgomery County the day before.
The suspects are taken to the Nashville City Police Station, where they are placed in separate rooms for questioning.
Prior to the interview starting, they were advised of their rights, and the interviews were done separately. Baldeo's interview was first.
All right, sir. Mr. Taneja, right?
Taneja.
Taneja. We were sent here to basically talk to you and get your side of the story, okay?
My first name is Baldeo Taneja. Let me tell you very bluntly, my wife is completely innocent.
Just 31 hours into the murder of Preeta Gaba, the investigation has led police from a Washington, D.C. suburb to Nashville, Tennessee, where they have arrested her ex-husband, Baldeo Taneja, and Baldeo's new wife, Raminder Kaur.
Baldeo's interview was first, and he understood his rights, and he immediately stated he wanted a lawyer. After he stated he wanted a lawyer, he continued to talk, and we got basic background information.
Baldeo Taneja was born and raised in India, the third child in a family of 7 boys.
I came to United States in 1978. I was 28 years of age. I came to the Ohio State University to get my PhD. And after that, I joined our federal government in the agency FDA, Food and Drug Administration. I was part of the team approving human drugs. I worked there for 10 years, and then I got involved in a business known as Amway. And they were about to open in India at that time. So I resigned from my job in 2000 and went to India for 7 years.
During that time, Baldeo fell in love with Preeta Gaba.
We got married in 2002. She was a very good partner because she was very good in managing things. So that attracted me to her. When I came back from India in 2007, I moved to Boston, Massachusetts, because I had a job there. I was there for 1 year. Then I came to Rockville, Maryland, working with a company.
Following his return to America in 2007, Baldeo was introduced to Raminder Kaur.
Through a common friend, I met Raminder, and we started talking. I really got attracted to her because I saw very nice characteristics in her. You know, loving and caring character and all that. I fell in love with her, and I proposed to her, and she said yes, and we got married after I got my divorce from Preeta, and that happened in 2011.
A lucrative job offer eventually took Baldeo and Raminder from Maryland to Nashville.
They paid me $175,000 a year plus $25,000 bonus every year. That was the deal. So I just moved to Tennessee. I could make more money. They had no state tax, so I could save money.
After learning more about Baldeo, investigators cut to the chase and confront him with Lim's allegation that he stopped paying his ex-wife alimony.
I was paying her close to $2,500 a month, and I was happy with that because I was making tons of money at that time.
We were able to reach an agreement that he would catch up his payments and he would not be found in contempt. And it was shortly after that she was killed.
Baldeo also has an explanation for the 2 handguns registered in his name.
I was thinking maybe we should have one because we live in the area.
Where he lived, or at least in his perception, it was a higher crime area in Tennessee.
I bought the guns so that I can protect myself and I can protect Raminder and my family, because there were gang shootings in the neighborhood. That was the reason. Raminder was totally against the guns. She has never touched a gun in her life. But I decided to buy anyway, and she went along with that. I ended up buying 2 guns, one for the house, one for the car.
He denied any involvement in the homicide, but with them purchasing guns that were revolvers in Nashville, we were confident that this is our couple. They planned this murder, and they came to Washington, D.C. area to kill Preeta Gaba.
So you're getting a search warrant, obviously, for your house and for your car, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So we're gonna recover those handguns, okay? Okay, so I'll be completely straight up with you, right? I mean, one of those guns is gonna be a murder weapon in our case.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk to your wife, I just hope she don't blame this thing on you.
Investigators next question Raminder, the presumed shooter, to see if she'll admit to her or Baldeo's involvement in Preeta's murder.
The shooter clearly appeared to be a woman, and we believe Raminder was the shooter.
But she denied any involvement in the homicide.
What do you want from me? I have nothing to do with anything.
As investigators press Raminder, she continues to deny knowing anything about the crime.
Just tell us why it happened. Like, what happened? Why did you and your husband?
Not in his mind.
I'm not talking about him. We're done. Seriously, we're done with you. You're gonna go down as this cold-blooded person.
While Baldeo and Raminder are held in custody, investigators continue to build their case against the couple and secure warrants for their phone records.
You're trying to find out where were they when the shooting took place. In a lot of ways we track people is we use cell phone records. It's a personal tracker. If your phone's on, we know where you are. They begin to realize the phone records are showing them initially in Nashville, but basically taking a path that looks like they are traveling and coming to Montgomery County. And this is based on the geopositioning of the cell tower information that we got from the provider.
The phone records show that the phones stayed in the Rockville area where they had checked into the Red Roof Inn, which is 10 minutes away from the shooting scene.
When investigators contact the hotel, they receive concrete proof that the couple was in Montgomery County together on the day of Preeta's murder.
We have video of him and Raminder checking into the hotel.
They checked in the night before, they left the next day. All the pieces began to come together.
Montgomery County Police have discovered evidence that Baldeo, Taneja, and Raminder Kaur were checked into a hotel nearby and not in Nashville, Tennessee, when Baldeo's ex-wife, Preeta Gaba, was murdered. Investigators confront Baldeo with the findings. He quickly admits that he and Raminder were in D.C., but offers up an explanation.
I went there on Friday, came back today.
What were you doing in Maryland from Friday to today?
I run a business with a company known as Amway. We have our mentorship team known as Your Association. It was their annual function in Washington, D.C. So I went there to attend that.
Who did you go with?
My wife.
Baldeo continues to deny that he and Raminder had any involvement in his ex-wife's murder. But investigators believe this is just another lie.
You're going to be brought up to Maryland for the conspiracy and murder charge.
Following Baldeo's interrogation, investigators look into the conference Baldeo claimed he and his wife had attended.
We researched Amway and learned that there was indeed a conference in Washington, D.C., and we were able to confirm that Baldeo did attend the conference.
When investigators track down conference attendees, Baldeo's alibi falls apart.
Somebody that was there that spoke to Baldeo explained to us that Baldeo was there for a very short amount of time.
They were seen for about 15 to 30 minutes by the people who were there. At one point, invited to lunch, and Baldeo said that his wife was ill. They talked to other people there, the police did, and they said that she didn't look ill to them.
You come up for the Amway convention, stay in the city. This community, Germantown, is 25 miles outside of Washington, D.C. And his phone was stationary on the 11th, and it goes off for hours, goes back on, and then it shows, after the shooting on the 12th, it shows movement into the District of Columbia. I think he was developing an alibi. After they do literally a drive-by at the Amway convention, they're back in their car on their way back to Nashville.
Investigators immediately file a search warrant for the couple's Nashville residence.
They find notes that Baldeo had written detailing information from a gun safety course. One of the things that the instructor told them was that handgun, that they leave shell casings behind. However, with a revolver, they do not. And so he's written all of this stuff down.
Those notes were relevant because we knew that we're looking for revolvers. At the residence, we did find documents of communications with Prita and Baldeo that reinforced that the divorce was contentious.
He didn't want to pay alimony to his wife, didn't want to have anything to do with her, thought that he could just kick her to the curb and be done with her.
He was $10,000 behind in payments. She had filed suit against him, and apparently just before the homicide, they had reached some sort of agreement where he agreed to pay all the alimony.
He had already paid 2/3 of the alimony that he had to pay. But it had been a very high conflict, acrimonious divorce.
Next, investigators conduct a search on the car Baldeo and Raminder were driving at the time of their arrest.
Recovered from the car 2 revolvers. Those guns were analyzed by our forensics unit, and they were able to determine that the Ruger LCR was the weapon that was used in the homicide. And what was interesting is we also found a wig and hair dye.
Who's running around with wigs and hair dyes and disguises in their car? People who don't want to be identified.
I believe that the wig was used to disguise the shooter at the time of the murder.
But either one of them could have worn the wig.
Coming up, Baldeo Taneja speaks out about Prita Gaba's murder for the first time.
Is there anything that you want to say to Lim or to Prita's loved ones?
Is there anything? Yes, the truth, what really happened.
Montgomery County Police have just uncovered a mountain of evidence connecting Baldeo Taneja and his wife, Raminder Kaur, to the murder of Baldeo's ex-wife, Prita Gaba.
At the indictment, they were charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and use of a handgun during a felony.
Prosecutors decided to try both Raminder and Baldeo together.
When the trial begins in late July 2014, the prosecution argues why both Baldeo and Raminder are at fault.
Baldeo makes a fairly nice living, and the neighborhood he was living in Nashville wasn't the best neighborhood. And I believe that Raminder was upset that they couldn't live or move up the social ladder due to the fact that he had to continue making alimony payments to Preeta.
I think what happens is you have people that sit around and talk to each other, and they get in their own world, and they get crazy. And they come up with these schemes. These are people who are, I would just say, evil. I mean, when you have decided in your 60s that you would rather kill somebody than pay alimony for a couple of years, then that's evil.
Prosecutor's theory was Baldeo, Taneja, and Raminder Kaur conspired and killed Preeta Gabba. No one can prove that. That's the problem. My defense attorney, Andrew Jacek, came up with defense theory.
The nature of the defense is that there was some other person that wanted revenge against her, and that Baldeo, a guy that was very successful, had everything to lose, would never do something like this.
It was very easy for me to pay her $2,500 a month, and Raminder never said anything against it.
They were convicted, both of them, of murder and conspiracy to first-degree murder.
On October 15, 2014, Baldeo is sentenced to life in prison.
Raminder was able to appeal her conviction, arguing ineffective representation by her counsel. And so Raminder got another trial in 2016 and was again found guilty. And in January of 2017, Raminder Kaur was also sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Preeta Gabba.
Is there anything that you want to say to Lim or to Preeta's loved ones?
Is there anything? Yes. And let me give you the truth. You don't have the truth. Weekend of October 12, 13, and 14, business conference was happening in Washington, D.C. I decided to talk to Preeta. So that Saturday morning, when my wife was sleeping, I got up, I got ready for my business conference, and I drove towards Preeta Gabba's apartment. So I parked on the side of the road around 7:30, waiting for her to come down. She came down. I called her name, Preetu. She looked at me, she said, "Ballu, what's up? What brings you here?" She said, "Ballu, I did not want your money. I wanted you. When I filed divorce case against you, thinking you will come back to your senses and you will come back to me. But you did not do that. Now the only thing I see is Raminder Kaur needs to go." I said, "Are you planning to kill my wife, Raminder Kaur?" She said, "Yes." From right pocket of my coat, I took my Ruger LCR out. I held the gun in my hands as I was taught in my gun school. And I looked at her. "I can pull the trigger and kill you right here." And she hit at the gun with her bag. And all the articles inside that bag came out. And then she mocked me. She said, "You wanna kill me?" "Nah, nah, 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 nah. Kill me, kill me, kill me." I pulled the trigger. Twice.
Tell me about those accusations that you had dressed up like her and you shot her.
That's a fake news. There's no truth to that.
The wig, was there a wig in the trunk of the car? Well, you said there was?
Yes, there was a wig. My wife saw that wig at CVS. It's a very small wig. It's a toy for children. And she thought that would be a good gift to send to her granddaughter. That was the purpose of buying that wig. And it was in the car. So you asked me the question, what will I say to Lim Gabba and Preeta's relatives. I take complete responsibility for Preeta Gabba's death. I am the one who shot her. I am the one who killed her. My wife is totally innocent. She has nothing to do with it. She was never a part of conspiracy with me. She was never at the scene. She never pulled the trigger. She is innocent. I'm sorry. I should not have done it. But I did it. I'm sorry. And if you can forgive me, I ask for your forgiveness.
I can't tell you Baldeo did the shooting. I can't tell you Raminder did the shooting. But Raminder walks with a limp, so witnesses that observe the suspect leaving the scene suggest it's her. And what I believe is Raminder was behind the plan for the shooting to occur.
She had the appearance of somebody who was very submissive, who was very passive, but I don't think that's how she was deep down.
It doesn't matter who pulled the trigger. They were together on this. They cooked this thing up together.
And I believe Raminder pulled the trigger, but quite candidly, they were both equally culpable in this conspiracy to end her life. It was a conspiracy between two people who came together collectively on a joint enterprise. They both, for their mutual financial benefit, decided to end this woman's life.
I still have this image of Preeta Gabba in my head that I can't get out. An image of a woman coming into my office with a big smile on her face, happy. How could I feel joy following her death? But I was happy that they will be held to account.
On a cold November morning in 1987, the silence stretching across the forests of northern Washington carried no warning that one of the Pacific Northwest's most haunting murder investigations had already begun. There were no flashing police lights cutting through the mist, no frantic emergency calls from terrified witnesses, no obvious crime scene waiting to be discovered. Instead, there was only absence. Two young people who had crossed an international border with ordinary plans simply vanished. They left behind no goodbye, no explanation, no final message. Their disappearance would become one of those stories whispered for decades whenever another unsolved case surfaced. Another missing person poster faded beneath rain. Another family waited beside a silent telephone. Long before the phrase genetic genealogy entered the vocabulary of criminal investigators, before DNA databases transformed impossible investigations into solvable puzzles, this case settled into the growing archive of cold cases that seemed destined to remain buried beneath layers of unanswered questions. For more than 3 decades, investigators would chase fragments instead of facts, possibilities instead of proof, while one killer quietly disappeared into ordinary life, carrying a secret that seemed certain to die with him. The tragedy began not with violence, but with hope. Jay Cook was 20 years old, responsible, hardworking, and known by friends as someone willing to help whenever he could. Tanya Van Queilenborg was 18, energetic, thoughtful, and looking forward to the future with the confidence common to young people who believed life was only beginning. They lived in British Columbia, Canada, just across the border from Washington state, part of a region where crossing between the two countries was a routine part of everyday life. Families visited relatives, friends shopped. Travelers passed through customs with little thought that the invisible line separating two nations could also become the dividing point between ordinary life and irreversible tragedy. During the weekend before Thanksgiving in November 1987, the young couple planned what appeared to be a simple errand. They intended to travel into Washington to pick up furnace parts for Tanya's father. It was neither a dangerous journey nor an unusual one. They packed lightly, expecting to return home after completing the trip. Nothing about their plans suggested they were stepping into the opening chapter of a case that investigators would still be discussing more than 30 years later. Family members watched them leave without imagining that this ordinary farewell would become their last memory. Every cold case begins with a moment that seems completely insignificant until viewed through the cruel clarity of hindsight. A casual goodbye, a promise to be home soon, a destination so familiar it hardly deserves discussion. For Jay and Tanya, that ordinary departure became frozen in time. As hours passed without contact, concern slowly replaced confidence. Their families initially considered the explanations most people would imagine. Perhaps the vehicle had broken down. Maybe they had stayed with friends. Maybe weather or mechanical trouble had delayed their return. But as one day became another, uncertainty hardened into fear. Missing adults can disappear for countless reasons, yet those who knew Jay and Tanya insisted something was terribly wrong. They had responsibilities waiting for them. They had family expecting them home. They had simply vanished without leaving any trace of the lives they intended to continue. Law enforcement agencies on both sides of the international border soon faced the complicated challenge of coordinating an investigation involving two countries, multiple jurisdictions, and almost no reliable evidence. In 1987, investigators worked in an era before smartphones recorded movements, before GPS silently tracked vehicles, before digital payment systems created electronic timelines, before surveillance cameras watched nearly every highway and parking lot. Every interview depended upon memory. Every witness account carried uncertainty. Every mile of road represented another opportunity for crucial evidence to disappear forever. The Pacific Northwest itself became another silent obstacle. Dense forests stretched across vast landscapes. Rural roads wound through isolated communities. Rivers, mountains, abandoned logging areas, and hidden clearings created countless places where evidence could vanish beyond immediate discovery. Detectives understood that time was already working against them. Every passing hour reduced the likelihood of finding witnesses who remembered seeing the couple. Rain threatened physical evidence. Vehicles traveled roads where tire tracks disappeared beneath fresh traffic. Memories faded with astonishing speed. Yet no one could have imagined how fragmented the investigation would soon become. Then the first devastating breakthrough arrived. On November 24th, 5 days after the couple crossed into Washington, Tanya Van Cuylenborg's body was discovered near a rural road outside the community of Mount Vernon. The location was isolated enough that someone familiar with the region might have expected the crime scene to remain hidden. Instead, chance intervened. Investigators responding to the discovery immediately recognized that the missing person investigation had transformed into a homicide inquiry. Tanya had been sexually assaulted before being murdered. The brutality shocked experienced investigators who had spent careers confronting violence. Yet even amid the horror, another question immediately emerged. Where was Jay Cook? Hope, however fragile, still existed that he might somehow be alive. That hope survived only 2 more days. On November 26th, Jay's body was found separately near Monroe, Washington, more than 60 miles from where Tanya had been discovered. Unlike Tanya, Jay had died from a gunshot wound to the head. His hands had been bound. The separation of the bodies suggested planning, movement, and an offender determined to complicate the investigation. Detectives suddenly faced not one crime scene, but several. The locations where the bodies were discovered might not be where the murders occurred. The vehicle remained missing. The timeline remained incomplete. Every answer produced 2 new questions. Why separate the victims? Why transport them to different counties? Why abandon them where they were eventually found? The investigation expanded rapidly. Detectives examined highways, interviewed truck drivers, questioned residents living near the discovery sites, and attempted to reconstruct every possible movement the young couple made after entering Washington. Each witness offered another piece of an incomplete puzzle. Some remembered seeing a van resembling the couple's vehicle. Others reported suspicious activity that could not be confirmed. Rumors spread through communities already frightened by the realization that a killer had operated across multiple counties before disappearing without detection. The media followed every development intensely. Headlines described a mysterious double homicide involving 2 young Canadians who had crossed the border for what should have been an ordinary shopping trip. Public sympathy was immediate. Parents imagined their own children taking similar weekend drives. Young couples recognized themselves in Jay and Tanya's plans. The randomness of the crime unsettled everyone. If 2 responsible young adults could vanish during a routine trip, who could truly feel safe? Then investigators located another crucial piece of evidence. The van the couple had been driving was eventually recovered in Portland, Oregon, hundreds of miles south of where the murders had occurred. Its discovery deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Whoever committed the crimes had apparently driven the vehicle far from the original crime scenes before abandoning it. That decision suggested mobility, confidence, and perhaps familiarity with interstate travel. Detectives carefully processed the van using every forensic method available in 1987. Fingerprints were collected. Fibers were examined. Biological evidence was preserved whenever possible. Yet forensic science of the era imposed severe limitations. DNA profiling was still in its infancy. Genetic genealogy did not exist. Evidence that might eventually identify a killer decades later remained scientifically silent. Investigators preserved items they hoped future technology might someday explain, unaware that this decision would ultimately become one of the most important choices made during the entire investigation. Behind every forensic report stood two devastated families whose lives had permanently divided into before and after. Holidays became anniversaries of loss. Birthdays became reminders of futures stolen. Instead of celebrating marriages, careers, or children, relatives attended memorials and answered reporters' questions year after year. They pleaded for information. They urged witnesses to come forward. They trusted investigators while enduring the exhausting cycle familiar to families of homicide victims. Hope after every report had led, disappointment after every dead end, determination despite the relentless passage of time. Detectives refused to abandon the investigation, but reality proved unforgiving. Hundreds of leads flowed into law enforcement. Potential suspects emerged and disappeared. Individuals were questioned, investigated, and eventually excluded. Some theories suggested robbery. Others proposed sexual violence escalating into murder. Some wondered whether the victims encountered a stranger by chance. Others believed they had crossed paths with someone actively hunting vulnerable travelers. Without a definitive suspect supported by physical evidence, every theory remained speculation. As months became years, the investigation entered the difficult territory known throughout law enforcement simply as a cold case. The phrase sounded clinical, almost detached, yet behind those two words existed shelves filled with reports, photographs, evidence bags, interview transcripts, forensic analyses, maps covered with handwritten notes, and investigators unwilling to admit defeat despite dwindling opportunities. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg slowly joined the growing list of crimes that haunted detectives long after retirement. New investigators inherited boxes assembled by predecessors who had spent years chasing answers without success. Every generation believed it might notice something overlooked by the last. Every generation eventually confronted the same silence. The killer remained invisible. Somewhere, an individual who had left behind fragments of evidence continued living an apparently ordinary existence while families waited for justice that never seemed to arrive. Yet hidden inside carefully preserved evidence collected back in 1987 rested a silent witness. It could not speak. It could not identify a face. It could not point investigators toward a name. For decades, it simply waited, untouched by time, protected inside evidence storage as science advanced beyond anything detectives standing beside those lonely Washington roads could have imagined. They had no way of knowing that the smallest biological trace left behind during one terrible weekend would eventually outlive fading memories, exhausted witnesses, changing investigative theories, and even entire careers, remaining patient until the future finally learned how to listen. By the winter of 1987, the investigation had already grown into one of the largest homicide cases involving both Washington State and British Columbia. Detectives understood they were not dealing with a spontaneous disappearance or an accident hidden by the wilderness. The evidence pointed toward a calculated sequence of violent crimes carried out across multiple locations, with the offender demonstrating enough confidence to move victims, abandon a vehicle hundreds of miles away, and vanish without leaving investigators a clear path to follow. Every new discovery answered one question only to create three more. Every confirmed fact exposed another gap in the timeline. Somewhere between the moment Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg crossed the Canadian border and the discovery of their bodies several days later, an unknown individual had seized complete control of two young lives. Reconstructing those missing hours became the central mission of the investigation, yet the further detectives looked, the more those hours seemed to dissolve into uncertainty. The known timeline appeared deceptively simple. On November 18th, still 1987, Jay and Tanya left British Columbia intending to travel into Washington State to collect furnace parts for Tanya's father. Family members expected them home soon afterward. They were driving a van and carried no indication that they planned to remain away overnight. They packed for an ordinary errand, not an extended trip. That ordinary expectation made their disappearance especially alarming once they failed to return. Investigators began asking the most basic questions first. Where had they crossed the border? Who had seen them afterward? Which roads were they likely to have taken? Did they stop for fuel, food, or directions? Every receipt, every possible witness, every remembered vehicle became a potential piece of the puzzle. Border crossings in the late 1980s were nothing like the heavily documented systems familiar today. Surveillance cameras were limited. Electronic databases were primitive compared with modern standards. Investigators relied heavily on paper records, eyewitness recollections, and routine documentation that often captured only fragments of a traveler's journey. Detectives reviewed customs information, hoping to establish an exact time and location for the couple's entry into the United States. That crossing became one of the last unquestionably documented moments of their lives. From there, certainty disappeared. The Pacific Northwest offered countless possible routes connecting communities spread across forests, farmland, and growing suburban corridors. Interstate highways carried thousands of travelers every day. Logging roads branched into isolated terrain. Small towns connected by winding highways created endless opportunities for a chance encounter to become something far more sinister. The detectives searched for anyone who might have remembered seeing the young Canadian couple, but memory is an unreliable witness. A face glimpsed briefly at a gas station rarely remains clear days later. A van parked beside another vehicle in a restaurant parking lot usually leaves no lasting impression. Even witnesses acting in complete good faith often remember details differently after repeated interviews. As investigators expanded the search area, reports poured into police departments from across Washington. Some callers believed they had seen the couple alive after the disappearance. Others reported suspicious strangers matching vague descriptions. Several tips suggested possible locations where the victims might have stopped. Most ultimately proved impossible to verify. Detectives pursued each lead because they had no luxury of dismissing possibilities. Every false lead consumed precious hours. Every dead end delayed attention from another potential clue. Meanwhile, forensic specialists continued processing the crime scenes with painstaking care. Taneja van Quillenborg had been discovered in Skagit County near Mount Vernon. The location itself revealed very little. It appeared to have been selected for its isolation rather than any personal connection to the victims. There was no evidence suggesting she knew the area. Detectives believed the site was likely chosen by the offender because it reduced the chance of immediate discovery. The surrounding environment presented familiar challenges. Rain, changing temperatures, wildlife, and natural decomposition all threatened fragile physical evidence before investigators could recover it. Jay Cook's body, found separately in Snohomish County near Monroe, complicated the investigation even further. The significant distance separating the recovery sites indicated deliberate movement after the crimes occurred. The detectives now faced several possibilities. The murders may have occurred at entirely different locations. The victims may have been separated while still alive. The offender may have transported them independently to delay discovery or confuse investigators. Each scenario suggested a level of organization inconsistent with a completely impulsive crime. The recovery of the van in Portland, Oregon, added another layer of complexity. Instead of abandoning the vehicle near either crime scene, the offender had driven it approximately 200 miles south. That decision carried significant implications. It suggested the killer was comfortable traveling long distances after committing murder. It also raised the possibility that the offender either lived elsewhere or deliberately wanted investigators looking in the wrong direction. The detectives coordinated with Oregon authorities, hoping the vehicle's appearance in Portland might produce witnesses who remembered seeing whoever abandoned it. The van itself became one of the investigation's most valuable pieces of evidence. Crime scene technicians examined every surface using the forensic methods available at the time. Latent fingerprints were lifted wherever possible. Fibers were collected. Biological material was carefully preserved. Hair samples, trace evidence, and other microscopic materials were documented with meticulous attention. Although DNA profiling existed only in its earliest experimental stages, experienced investigators understood that preserving biological evidence could someday prove valuable, even if contemporary science lacked the ability to interpret it fully. That decision would eventually prove extraordinary. In 1987, however, the preserved evidence offered little immediate assistance. Detectives still relied primarily on interviews, fingerprints, ballistics, and traditional investigative methods. Firearms experts examined the bullet recovered from Jay Cook, attempting to determine the type of weapon used. While they could establish certain characteristics, no firearm matching the evidence emerged during the investigation. Without the weapon itself, ballistic analysis reached its practical limits. The sexual assault committed against Taneja introduced another deeply important forensic component. Biological evidence recovered during the autopsy was preserved according to the standards of the time. Investigators recognized its potential value, but technology simply had not advanced enough to transform that evidence into a suspect's identity. Instead, it became another carefully labeled item placed into secure storage, waiting through years that no one could accurately predict. As detectives continued interviewing people connected to the victims, they quickly eliminated many of the explanations that commonly appear during homicide investigations. There was no evidence suggesting Jay or Tanya had planned to disappear voluntarily. Financial records revealed no preparation for leaving their lives behind. Family members consistently described healthy relationships and ordinary future plans. Friends reported nothing indicating either young person feared imminent danger. Investigators found no credible evidence linking the murders to organized crime, personal enemies, or domestic conflict. Attention, therefore, shifted increasingly toward the possibility of a stranger attack. The randomness of that possibility frightened communities throughout Washington and British Columbia. Newspapers reported on the murders extensively, emphasizing that to ordinary young adults had apparently encountered extreme violence during what should have been a routine trip. Parents warned children about accepting help from strangers. Travelers became more cautious at highway rest areas. Local residents began paying closer attention to unfamiliar vehicles parked along isolated roads. The detectives also considered whether similar crimes elsewhere might reveal a pattern. During the 1970s and 1980s, several violent offenders had operated across the Pacific Northwest, targeting vulnerable victims along highways and rural communities. Investigators compared evidence from the Cook and Van Cuylenborg murders against numerous unsolved and solved cases involving sexual assault, kidnapping, and homicide. Some similarities appeared, but none strong enough to establish a definitive connection. As each comparison ended without confirmation, another possible path quietly closed. The passage of time soon became one of the investigation's greatest enemies. Witnesses moved away. Businesses closed. Telephone numbers changed. Records disappeared. Memories blurred. People who might once have remembered an unfamiliar van parked nearby gradually forgot details that had seemed insignificant at the time. Investigators repeatedly returned to earlier witnesses, hoping fresh questions might uncover overlooked information, but memory rarely improves with age. Instead, uncertainty often grows stronger while confidence becomes misplaced. Inside police departments, however, the case refused to disappear completely. Detectives assigned to major crimes developed a personal attachment to investigations that resisted solution. Boxes filled with reports accumulated in evidence rooms. Maps remained marked with colored pins identifying witness sightings, body recovery locations, and potential routes traveled by the victims. Photographs faded slightly with age, but continued documenting every recovered item, every crime scene measurement, every carefully collected sample. New detectives inherited those files from retiring investigators. Each believed fresh eyes might identify something everyone else had missed. Some spent weeks reviewing interview transcripts line by line. Others revisited crime scenes decades later. Several reconstructed driving routes exactly as they would have appeared in November 1987. Again and again, they reached the same painful conclusion. The evidence was real. The murders were undeniable. But the offender remained unidentified. For the victims' families, the investigation became part of everyday life rather than an isolated tragedy. Every anniversary reopened old wounds. Every media report promising renewed investigative efforts created cautious optimism. Detectives maintained contact whenever meaningful developments occurred, yet meaningful developments became increasingly rare. The case settled into the uncomfortable category shared by thousands of unsolved homicides across North America, never forgotten, never solved, permanently suspended between hope and disappointment. Still, one aspect distinguished this investigation from many others. The physical evidence had survived. Unlike countless older homicide cases where biological material had been lost, contaminated, or discarded before modern forensic standards existed, investigators in this case had preserved critical evidence with remarkable care. Refrigerated storage, documented chains of custody, and disciplined evidence management ensured that samples collected in 1987 remained available for future examination at the time. No one could predict exactly what future science might accomplish. Detectives simply refused to destroy evidence that might someday matter. Years turned into decades. DNA profiling gradually transformed criminal investigations around the world. Offenders who once believed themselves untouchable began appearing in courtrooms after biological evidence connected them to long-forgotten crimes. National DNA databases expanded. Laboratory techniques improved dramatically. Cold case units reopened investigations once considered impossible. Each technological breakthrough inspired renewed hope inside the offices where the Cook and Van Queilenborg files still occupied their shelves. Investigators periodically resubmitted preserved evidence for testing using newer methods unavailable during the original investigation. Every advance extracted more information from smaller biological samples. Profiles became clearer. Laboratory accuracy improved. Scientific possibilities expanded beyond anything imagined in 1987. Yet even with those remarkable advances, one enormous obstacle remained. A DNA profile alone could identify no one unless investigators had something or someone to compare it against. The unknown killer had never been arrested for an offense requiring DNA collection. His profile existed only as a string of genetic markers stored inside laboratory files, representing a human being whose name, face, age, occupation, and history remained completely unknown. The science had finally learned how to hear the silent witness preserved decades. The calendar continued to move forward, but inside the evidence room, time appeared frozen. Brown cardboard boxes remained sealed. Plastic evidence bags carried dates from November 1987. Handwritten labels, fading slightly after years in storage, still identified the same items collected during the first frantic days of the investigation. The detectives came and went. Police chiefs retired. Prosecutors changed. Technology transformed nearly every aspect of criminal investigations. Yet the murders of Jay Cook and Taneja Van Queilenborg remained suspended in a strange state between progress and paralysis. The evidence existed. The victims had names, faces, histories, and families who never stopped waiting. What investigators lacked was the final bridge connecting physical proof to a living suspect. For years, that bridge simply did not exist. Cold cases often die quietly, not because detectives stop caring, but because every traditional avenue has already been exhausted. Every witness has been interviewed. Every known suspect has been examined. Every available forensic test has been completed using the best technology of its time. Eventually, the investigation enters a difficult phase where progress depends less on detective work than on circumstance. A guilty conscience, an unexpected confession, a forgotten piece of evidence, or a scientific breakthrough no one could have predicted when the crime occurred. Throughout the 1990s, DNA technology steadily matured. What had once been an experimental forensic tool gradually became one of the most powerful forms of criminal evidence ever developed. Laboratories learned to generate reliable genetic profiles from increasingly small biological samples. Quartets accepted DNA as compelling evidence. Investigators across North America watched seemingly impossible cases collapse under the weight of scientific certainty. The Cook and Van Queilenborg investigation benefited from these advances, but only partially. The biological evidence preserved from 1987 was tested using improved methods. Scientists successfully developed a DNA profile believed to belong to the perpetrator. For detectives, this represented an extraordinary achievement. They now possessed something investigators in 1987 could only dream about: a unique genetic signature left behind during the crime. But possessing a DNA profile and identifying its owner were two completely different challenges. Investigators submitted the unknown profile to available law enforcement databases, hoping for an immediate match. Nothing. They searched again as databases expanded. Still nothing. Years passed. More convicted offenders entered the system. Again, the profile was compared. Again, no match appeared. The unknown DNA belonged to someone who, at least according to available records, had never been required to submit a sample to criminal databases. Detectives could now recognize the killer's genetic identity if he ever entered the system. But until that happened, the profile remained anonymous. For many investigations, this would have marked another dead end. The case remained active, but meaningful progress slowed once again. Despite the frustration, investigators refused to abandon their review of the original evidence. Modern forensic science encouraged detectives to revisit assumptions made decades earlier. Crime scene reconstruction improved dramatically. Behavioral analysis evolved. Investigators reconsidered the sequence of events using fresh perspectives developed through years of studying violent offenders. One question remained especially troubling. How had the offender managed to control two young adults? Jay Cook was a healthy 20-year-old man. Taneja Van Queilenborg was 18. Overpowering one victim presented challenges. controlling to simultaneously suggested planning, deception, the use of a weapon, or circumstances investigators still did not fully understand. Some detectives theorized the couple may have accepted assistance from someone they believed to be trustworthy. Vehicle trouble, requests for directions, or other seemingly harmless interactions could rapidly become dangerous under the wrong circumstances. Others believed the offender may have surprised them unexpectedly, using intimidation and firearms to gain immediate compliance. The evidence could support several possibilities. It confirmed none. The locations where the victims were discovered also continued to generate discussion among investigators. Neither recovery site appeared random. Both were relatively isolated, yet accessible enough for someone familiar with local roads. Detectives studied maps repeatedly, examining traffic patterns, logging routes, and secondary highways available during the late 1980s. They considered whether the offender lived nearby, worked in the region, or simply knew the area through travel. Behavioral analysts contributed another perspective. The transportation of both victims, the separation of their bodies, and the eventual abandonment of the van hundreds of miles away suggested an offender capable of remaining organized after committing violent crimes. Rather than panicking immediately afterward, the individual appeared able to make decisions intended to complicate the investigation. Such behavior often reflected confidence, perhaps experience, possibly prior criminal activity. Yet once again, no evidence definitively answered those questions. As the investigation entered its second decade, public attention naturally shifted elsewhere. New crimes dominated headlines. Fresh tragedies demanded immediate resources. Detectives assigned to current homicide investigations often had little choice but to prioritize cases where witnesses remained available and evidence was still fresh. Cold case investigators understood this reality better than anyone. Their work rarely unfolded under television cameras. There were no dramatic arrests following overnight investigations. Instead, progress consisted of reading thousands of pages of reports already read by countless detectives before them, listening again to old interviews, comparing forgotten details, studying photographs under improved forensic techniques, searching patiently for one overlooked inconsistency capable of changing everything. Behind that patience stood the families. For relatives of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quaylenborg, the passage of time never reduced the importance of the case. Parents grew older. Siblings built families of their own. Children entered the world having never met the aunt, uncle, son, or daughter whose absence continued shaping every family gathering. Photographs became treasured reminders of lives permanently interrupted at 18 and 20 years old. While investigators examined evidence, relatives preserved memories. Birthdays, conversations, laughter, plans that would never become reality. They also endured an emotional burden familiar to families of unsolved homicide victims. Not knowing who committed the crime, not knowing why, not knowing whether justice would ever arrive. That uncertainty often proves as cruel as grief itself. Psychologists studying families affected by unresolved violent crime have long recognized that unanswered questions prevent the emotional closure many people associate with mourning. Every anniversary renews hope that perhaps this year investigators will finally call with answers. Every announcement involving advances in forensic science rekindles optimism. Every disappointment becomes another reminder that waiting itself can become a lifelong experience. Meanwhile, the unknown offender continued living somewhere. That reality haunted investigators. The individual responsible had likely built an ordinary life. Neighbors may have considered him respectable. Co-workers may have trusted him. Friends may have shared holidays, celebrations, and conversations without ever suspecting that decades earlier he had allegedly committed one of the Pacific Northwest's most disturbing unsolved double homicides. Detectives repeatedly reminded themselves that appearances often concealed extraordinary secrets. History had already demonstrated this many times. Across North America, offenders responsible for murders committed decades earlier had eventually been identified living remarkably conventional lives. Teachers, business owners, military veterans, family men, retirees. Ordinary routines frequently masked extraordinary crimes. As DNA technology continued advancing during the early 2000s, laboratories became capable of extracting increasingly detailed genetic information from preserved evidence. Improvements in amplification techniques allowed scientists to recover usable profiles from biological samples once considered inadequate. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg evidence remained scientifically valuable precisely because investigators in 1987 had preserved it carefully. Every improvement in forensic capability encouraged another review. Every review confirmed the same frustrating reality. The DNA profile remained strong. The identity remained unknown. Then another revolution quietly began outside traditional law enforcement. It did not originate inside police laboratories. It emerged from ordinary people curious about their ancestry. Commercial genealogy companies introduced DNA testing directly to consumers. Millions of individuals voluntarily submitted saliva samples hoping to discover distant relatives, ancestral origins, or family history. Their motivations had nothing to do with criminal investigations. They simply wanted to know where they came from. Year after year, those consumer databases expanded dramatically. At first, detectives viewed this development with curiosity rather than expectation. The databases were not designed for police work. They existed for genealogy, family history, personal discovery. But a handful of investigators and forensic scientists began asking an extraordinary question. What if an unknown criminal's DNA could be linked not directly to the offender, but to distant relatives who had voluntarily entered genealogy databases? The concept sounded almost impossible. Instead of searching for one exact genetic match, investigators might identify cousins, second cousins, third cousins, relatives separated by generations. Family trees could then be reconstructed using historical records until one individual emerged as the only plausible suspect. It represented an entirely different philosophy of criminal investigation. Not searching for the person, searching for the person's family. Initially, the technique remained largely theoretical. Few imagined how profoundly it would transform cold case investigations. Many detectives remained cautious. The process required extraordinary precision. Mistakes in genealogy research could wrongly implicate innocent families. Every genetic connection demanded careful verification. Traditional investigative methods still remained essential. Genealogy could suggest possibilities. Evidence still had to prove guilt. For investigators assigned to the Cook and Van Cuylenborg murders, these emerging developments generated cautious optimism. The preserved DNA profile might someday become more valuable than anyone had imagined. Not because it matched an offender already in police databases, because it might eventually lead detectives toward relatives who had unknowingly left a trail stretching backward through generations. Years earlier, such an idea would have sounded like science fiction. Now respected forensic experts began discussing it seriously. Cold case detectives watched closely. Some believed they were witnessing the future. Others wondered whether legal, ethical, and scientific challenges would limit its practical use. The debate continued while technology advanced. Each year, genealogy databases grew larger. Each year, algorithms improved. Each year, more families contributed their genetic information voluntarily. Without realizing it, millions of ordinary people were collectively creating something unprecedented, a vast map of human relationships extending across continents and centuries. Somewhere within that expanding network, investigators believed, the unknown killer might unknowingly have relatives. People entirely innocent of any crime. People who had simply mailed DNA samples hoping to learn about grandparents or family origins. Those innocent submissions could someday illuminate a path investigators had searched for since November 1987. Still, no guarantees existed. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation remained officially unsolved. No arrest. No identified suspect. No prosecution. Only evidence waiting for science to catch up with the questions detectives had been asking for decades. Inside secure evidence storage, the biological sample collected from the original investigation remained exactly where technicians had placed it years earlier. Silent. Patient. Unchanged. Outside those storage rooms, however, the world had transformed. The scientific tools necessary to finally hear what that evidence had been trying to say were beginning to emerge. And for the first time since the murders, investigators could realistically imagine a future in which the unknown DNA profile might no longer represent an anonymous ghost hidden inside laboratory records, but the beginning of a name, a family, and ultimately, a A man whose ordinary life was about to collide with a crime he may have believed history had already forgotten. For nearly 3 decades, the investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg existed in a strange limbo. It was never abandoned, never forgotten, but it refused to move. Every few years, advances in forensic science encouraged another review. Detectives reopened evidence boxes. Laboratory technicians retested preserved samples using methods unavailable only a few years earlier. Supervisors reassigned experienced investigators to examine old reports with fresh eyes. Yet every cycle ended the same way. The evidence remained compelling. The DNA profile remained intact. The victims still had no justice. The unknown offender remained exactly that unknown. It became the kind of case every homicide investigator remembers long after retirement, not because of the complexity alone, but because everyone involved believed the answer existed somewhere inside the evidence. They simply lacked the technology to reach it. Then, during the middle of the 2010s, something extraordinary happened in American criminal investigations. It did not begin with a police department. It did not begin with a prosecutor. It began with a revolutionary idea that challenged the traditional limits of forensic science. Instead of asking whether the unknown DNA belonged to someone already listed in a criminal database, investigators began asking a completely different question. What if the killer's relatives had voluntarily submitted their DNA for genealogy research? That single shift in perspective changed everything. For decades, forensic DNA had functioned like fingerprint identification. Investigators searched for one exact match. If the individual had never entered the criminal justice system, no match existed. Cases stalled indefinitely. Genetic genealogy ignored that limitation. Instead of searching for one person, scientists searched entire family networks. A second cousin. A third cousin. A great-grandparent shared more than a century earlier. Tiny fragments of shared DNA could reveal relationships that traditional police databases were never designed to recognize. The process sounded deceptively simple. In reality, it required extraordinary expertise. Forensic genealogists first compared the unknown DNA profile against publicly available genealogy databases where users had chosen to allow law enforcement access under specific conditions. They examined hundreds or even thousands of potential genetic relatives, many sharing only small percentages of DNA with the unknown individual. None of those relatives were suspects. Most had never heard of the case. Many lived ordinary lives completely disconnected from law enforcement. Their only connection was biology. From there, genealogists began constructing enormous family trees. Birth records, marriage certificates, death certificates, military records, census documents, obituaries, newspaper archives, immigration files, property records. Every historical document capable of connecting one generation to another became part of the investigation. The work resembled detective work mixed with historical research. Months of painstaking analysis often reduced thousands of possible individuals to dozens. Then dozens became 10. 10 became 5. Eventually, one family branch began attracting particular attention. By this time, several high-profile investigations had already demonstrated the remarkable potential of genetic genealogy. Cases previously considered impossible had suddenly produced viable suspects after decades without meaningful progress. Law enforcement agencies across the United States watched those successes carefully. Cold case investigators who had spent entire careers waiting for scientific breakthroughs suddenly found themselves standing at the edge of one. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were among the cases that appeared ideally suited for this emerging technology. Investigators possessed well-preserved biological evidence. They possessed a reliable DNA profile. They possessed decades of investigative records eliminating numerous alternative explanations. What they lacked was identity. Genetic genealogy promised exactly that. The decision to pursue this approach required patience as much as optimism. Unlike television crime dramas, genealogy investigations rarely produce overnight breakthroughs. Researchers spent countless hours examining family histories stretching back generations. Every branch required verification. Every relationship demanded documentation. Mistakes could send investigators toward entirely innocent individuals. Precision was essential. As genealogists worked, detectives quietly continued more traditional investigative tasks. They compared historical addresses, employment records, vehicle registrations, travel histories, any information capable of determining whether emerging candidates could realistically have committed the crimes in November 1987. The investigation advanced carefully, deliberately, one verified fact at a time. Eventually, the genealogy research narrowed toward a family line producing one particularly significant individual. His name had never appeared during the original investigation. He had not become a suspect in 1987. He had never matched the offender's DNA profile because his DNA had never been entered into law enforcement databases. For decades, he had lived beyond the reach of traditional forensic identification. Now, for the first time, investigators believed they might finally know where to look. The individual was William Earl Talbot Sethet. At first, his name meant almost nothing outside his immediate community. He was not a notorious criminal. He had not spent years attracting public attention. To investigators, however, his background immediately warranted careful examination. They did not rush toward arrest. They understood genealogy produced investigative leads, not courtroom evidence. Every conclusion still required independent confirmation. Detectives began reconstructing Talbot's life just as thoroughly as they had reconstructed the victim's final movements decades earlier. Where had he lived in 1987? Did he have access to the regions where the crimes occurred? Could he realistically have encountered Jay and Tanya? Did physical evidence exist capable of scientifically confirming what genealogy now suggested? These questions became the investigation's new priority. Unlike the uncertain speculation that characterized earlier decades, detectives now possessed a focused direction. For the first time since November 1987, the investigation revolved around one identifiable individual rather than an anonymous DNA profile. Still, experienced investigators remained cautious. History had taught them not to confuse possibility with proof. The next phase required obtaining Talbot's DNA without alerting him to the investigation. This technique had become increasingly common in modern criminal investigations. Individuals routinely discard items containing biological material: coffee cups, drinking straws, napkins, cigarette butts, utensils, water bottles. Once abandoned in public, such items may legally provide investigators with DNA suitable for comparison under certain circumstances, depending on applicable laws and judicial oversight. Detectives conducted discreet surveillance. They observed routines, waited patiently, avoided unnecessary attention. The objective was simple: recover discarded biological material. Nothing more. Eventually, investigators succeeded. The recovered sample was submitted for laboratory analysis. The comparison that followed represented one of the most significant forensic moments in the history of the investigation. Scientists compared the newly obtained DNA profile with the biological evidence preserved since 1987. The result was exactly what detectives had hoped and cautiously feared. The profiles matched. More than 30 years after Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg disappeared during what should have been an ordinary trip into Washington, investigators finally possessed scientific evidence identifying a suspect. For detectives who had inherited the case from previous generations, the moment carried enormous emotional weight. Some remembered opening the original evidence boxes years earlier. Others had spoken repeatedly with surviving family members. Many understood they were completing work begun by investigators who had since retired or passed away. The breakthrough belonged not to one detective, but to decades of persistence. Yet, even after the DNA comparison confirmed the investigative direction, detectives continued building the case carefully. Arresting a suspect after 30 years required extraordinary preparation. Witnesses had aged. Some had died. Physical evidence required meticulous documentation. Every investigative step needed to withstand intense scrutiny inside a courtroom. Defense attorneys would almost certainly challenge the reliability of genetic genealogy itself. Prosecutors therefore focused not on genealogy as proof of guilt, but on the direct DNA match obtained independently after identifying Talbot through genealogical research. The distinction mattered enormously. Genetic genealogy pointed investigators toward a suspect. The traditional forensic DNA comparison supplied the evidentiary foundation. This careful separation strengthened the legal case while demonstrating how emerging science could work alongside established forensic principles rather than replacing them. News of the investigation remained confidential while detectives finalized their preparations. Few outside law enforcement realized that one of Washington's most enduring cold cases had suddenly accelerated toward resolution. For the victims' families, nothing had changed yet. They continued living with decades of unanswered questions. They had experienced renewed investigative optimism before. False hope had become painfully familiar. Detectives therefore remained cautious about raising expectations until the evidence reached the point where formal legal action became unavoidable. Inside police departments, however, quiet excitement spread. Veteran investigators recognized the historical significance of what was unfolding. Cold cases that once appeared permanently unsolvable were entering an entirely new era. Evidence preserved decades earlier suddenly possessed investigative value unimaginable when originally collected. Scientific patience had accomplished what relentless interviewing, traditional forensic comparisons, and thousands of investigative hours could not. One preserved biological sample had survived long enough for the future to finally understand it. The significance extended beyond a single investigation. Law enforcement agencies across North America watched similar breakthroughs closely. Each successful identification encouraged renewed examination of other unsolved murders. Evidence rooms filled with aging case files no longer represented only history. They represented possibility. Detectives who once believed retirement would arrive before answers now found themselves reopening investigations many considered permanently beyond solution. For the Cook and Van Cuylenborg case, however, one final obstacle remained. Scientific evidence had identified a suspect. The investigation had narrowed dramatically. But no courtroom had yet heard the evidence. No jury had weighed the facts. No verdict had been delivered. The decades-long search was approaching its most consequential moment, where years of patient investigation would finally leave the evidence room and enter the courtroom, where science, memory, and justice would be tested together for the very first time. The investigation had crossed a line that detectives once believed they might never reach. For more than 30 years, the murders of Jay Cook and Taneja Van Cuylenborg had existed as a mystery defined by unanswered questions, preserved evidence, and fading memories. Now, for the first time, investigators had a name supported by modern forensic science. But identifying a suspect and proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt were two entirely different challenges. Cold case detectives understood that history was filled with investigations that appeared solved inside police files but failed inside courtrooms. DNA could identify a person. Prosecutors still had to demonstrate that the evidence, viewed alongside every documented fact, established criminal responsibility under the law. After decades of waiting, no one intended to rush the final steps. Investigators reviewed every page of the original case file again. Interview transcripts from 1987. Crime scene photographs. Autopsy reports. Maps showing the locations where the victims had been discovered. Laboratory reports documenting every piece of preserved evidence. Nothing was considered too small to revisit. Every detail had to be examined as if the murders had occurred only days earlier. This time, however, detectives were reading those documents with something their predecessors never possessed: a suspect's identity. That single difference changed how investigators interpreted years of accumulated information. Questions that had once been theoretical became specific. Could William Earl Talbot have been present in the region during November 1987? Did his known movements fit the timeline? Did any witnesses unknowingly describe him decades earlier? Were there overlooked connections between his life and the locations involved in the investigation? Detectives reconstructed his history with extraordinary care. Employment records, residential addresses, vehicle ownership, associates, family relationships, routine travel patterns. Each verified fact either strengthened or weakened the developing case. Unlike dramatic fictional investigations, real homicide prosecutions demand patience. Every assumption requires documentation. Every conclusion requires evidence. The DNA match remained the centerpiece of the investigation, but prosecutors understood juries often expect a complete narrative explaining how all the available evidence fits together. Meanwhile, investigators maintained strict confidentiality. Very few people outside the investigative team knew how dramatically the case had changed. Experience had taught detectives that premature publicity could complicate an arrest, influence witness testimony, or encourage unnecessary speculation. Silence remained one of their most valuable investigative tools. For the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg, daily life continued much as it had for years. The long wait for answers had become part of their reality. Decades earlier, every unexpected telephone call had triggered hope. Eventually, hope itself became cautious. Families affected by unresolved homicide often describe living in two different timelines simultaneously. The outside world moves forward. Children grow older. Careers begin and end. Homes change. Communities evolve. Inside the family, however, one moment never truly passes. November 1987 remained permanently present. The last conversations. The last smiles. The last ordinary plans. Time continued. The absence remained unchanged. Detectives understood this emotional burden. Many had spent years maintaining relationships with surviving relatives. Some investigators had attended memorial events. Others had promised families they would never close the file simply because it had grown old. Those promises carried enormous personal weight. Cold case investigators often inherit not only evidence, but expectations built over generations. When the time finally came to inform family members that the investigation had reached a major breakthrough, detectives approached the conversations carefully. Hope had returned before. This time, however, the evidence was different. The DNA comparison had fundamentally altered the case. Investigators explained what genetic genealogy had accomplished. They emphasized an important distinction. Genealogy itself had not convicted anyone. Instead, it had identified a likely suspect, allowing detectives to obtain an independent DNA sample through lawful investigative methods. That independent comparison produced the evidentiary match supporting the case. For many family members, the scientific terminology mattered less than the simple reality they had waited decades to hear. The investigation finally had a suspect. Relief mixed with disbelief. Some relatives later described struggling to process the news. 30 years of uncertainty had conditioned them against expecting resolution. Now detectives were telling them the impossible had become possible. The emotional impact proved overwhelming. For investigators, another crucial phase remained. Arrest. On May 18, 2018, law enforcement officers arrested William Earl Talbot Taneja in Washington state. The arrest marked one of the most significant developments in the history of forensic genealogy. News spread rapidly. Media organizations across North America immediately recognized the broader implications. Another decades-old cold case had apparently been solved through emerging DNA technology. Headlines focused on both the murders and the revolutionary investigative methods that had revived them. The story extended far beyond Washington. Police agencies throughout the United States began examining their own unsolved homicide files with renewed optimism. Evidence that had remained scientifically silent for decades suddenly seemed capable of speaking again. Public reaction reflected both fascination and relief. Many people had followed previous genealogy-based investigations with curiosity. Now another high-profile cold case appeared to demonstrate that offenders who escaped justice for decades might still face prosecution. Communities where unsolved murders had faded into painful history found renewed hope. Families elsewhere contacted police departments asking whether preserved evidence from their loved ones' cases might also benefit from new forensic methods. The Cook and Van Queilenborg investigation had become something larger than a single prosecution. It represented proof that time alone no longer guaranteed safety for those responsible for violent crimes. For detectives who had spent years working the investigation, however, media attention remained secondary. Their focus shifted immediately toward trial preparation. Cold case prosecutions present unique challenges rarely encountered in more recent investigations. Witnesses become elderly. Some die before trial. Physical evidence must be carefully explained to juries unfamiliar with investigative methods from previous decades. Defense attorneys naturally examine every procedural decision made over 30 years. Evidence storage. Laboratory protocols. Chain of custody. Documentation. Every step receives careful scrutiny. Fortunately for prosecutors, the original investigators had preserved evidence with remarkable professionalism. Documentation remained comprehensive. Laboratory procedures had been carefully recorded. Evidence storage met required standards. The biological material linking the suspect to the crime had survived decades without compromising its forensic integrity. Those decisions made in 1987 now proved invaluable. Detectives who collected evidence decades earlier could not have imagined genetic genealogy. What they did understand was something fundamental to homicide investigations. Never discard evidence simply because current science cannot fully explain it. Future investigators may possess tools unavailable today. That philosophy ultimately transformed the case. The defense team prepared its own strategy. As in every criminal prosecution, the accused remained legally presumed innocent unless proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense attorneys questioned aspects of the investigation and challenged the reliability of various conclusions presented by prosecutors. They examined forensic procedures, investigative assumptions, and witness testimony with expected rigor. Such scrutiny forms an essential component of the criminal justice process, particularly in serious cases carrying significant potential penalties. The courtroom would ultimately determine whether the evidence satisfied the legal standard required for conviction. Outside legal proceedings, discussions about forensic genealogy expanded rapidly. Scientists, attorneys, ethicists, and privacy advocates debated the implications of using genealogy databases during criminal investigations. Supporters emphasized the technology's extraordinary ability to solve violent crimes that had remained unresolved for decades. Critics raised questions concerning privacy, informed consent, and the future use of consumer genetic information. The debates proved complex. Yet within the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation, one principle remained clear. The genealogy research had generated an investigative lead. The criminal case itself rested upon independently obtained forensic DNA evidence and the broader body of documented investigative findings. That distinction continued shaping public understanding of the prosecution. Meanwhile, detectives reflected upon the extraordinary journey the investigation had traveled. In 1987, they relied upon paper maps, handwritten reports, film photography, primitive computer systems, laboratory methods still developing. 3 decades later, digital forensic databases, advanced DNA analysis, sophisticated evidence preservation techniques, and genetic genealogy had combined to accomplish what once appeared impossible. The investigation itself had become a historical illustration of forensic science evolving alongside criminal justice. For the families, however, technology was never the central story. Jay Cook remained 20 years old in every family photograph. Taneja Van Cuylenborg remained 18. The years stolen from them could never be restored. Birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, careers, children. Entire futures had disappeared during a single November weekend. No courtroom outcome could erase that loss. Justice, if achieved, would never mean restoration. Only accountability. Only answers. Only the certainty that the mystery haunting their family for more than 30 years no longer remained unanswered. As prosecutors finalized preparations for trial, investigators understood they were approaching the final stage of an investigation spanning multiple generations of law enforcement officers. Some detectives who originally worked the case had already retired. Others had passed away. The responsibility now belonged to those who inherited the evidence, respected the work of those before them, and trusted that scientific progress would eventually reward decades of patience. The courtroom would soon determine whether the preserved evidence collected in 1987, strengthened by modern forensic science and decades of persistent investigation, would finally transform one of the Pacific Northwest's most enduring cold cases from an unsolved mystery into a documented act of justice. The courtroom was quiet, but the weight carried into it had been building for more than 30 years. Every chair, every exhibit table, every carefully labeled evidence box represented a chapter in an investigation that had outlived careers, technological revolutions, and generations of detectives. The murders of Jay Cook and Taneja Van Cuylenborg had long since become more than a homicide case. They had become a symbol of persistence, a reminder that some investigations refuse to disappear, even when every obvious path has ended. Now, after decades of unanswered questions, prosecutors stood before a jury prepared to present a case built from evidence collected in 1987 and strengthened by scientific advances that had not even existed when the victims lost their lives. From the very beginning, prosecutors understood that this would not resemble an ordinary homicide trial. Most criminal prosecutions rely heavily on recent memories. Witnesses recall conversations. Investigators describe fresh crime scenes. Physical evidence has been collected only months earlier. Here, the passage of time shaped every aspect of the proceedings. More than 3 decades had passed. Many original witnesses struggled to remember details with the same clarity they once possessed. Some individuals connected to the investigation were no longer alive to testify. Documents had become historical records. Photographs taken on film now served as windows into a crime scene preserved only through careful documentation. The prosecution therefore relied on a combination of preserved physical evidence, forensic testimony, investigative records, and scientific analysis developed over many years. Jurors were guided through the original investigation. They learned how Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg crossed into Washington from British Columbia during November 1987. They heard how the couple never returned home. They saw maps documenting where Tanya's body had been discovered near Mount Vernon and where J.S. body was later found near Monroe. The significant distance separating those locations illustrated the deliberate movement that investigators believed followed the crimes. The abandoned van, recovered in Portland, Oregon, became another important part of the narrative. Each location demonstrated planning rather than chaos. Each recovery site reflected an offender who had attempted to complicate the investigation. The jury also heard testimony explaining the extraordinary care taken by investigators during the original collection of evidence. Crime scene technicians described procedures used to preserve biological material. Evidence custodians explained how samples had remained securely stored through decades of changing forensic standards. Laboratory personnel documented the chain of custody that protected the integrity of every critical exhibit. In cold case prosecutions, confidence in evidence preservation often becomes just as important as the evidence itself. Every sealed container, every laboratory submission, every documented transfer mattered. The prosecution then turned toward the scientific developments that transformed the investigation. Expert witnesses carefully explained DNA analysis in language understandable to jurors without scientific backgrounds. They described how biological material recovered during the investigation produced a genetic profile belonging to the unknown offender. That profile remained unidentified for years despite repeated comparisons with criminal databases. The absence of a database match did not weaken the evidence. It simply demonstrated that the person who left the DNA had not previously been identified through those particular systems. The jury next learned about genetic genealogy. Experts emphasized an important legal distinction. The genealogy research itself did not establish guilt. Instead, it generated an investigative led by identifying potential biological relatives of the unknown DNA contributor. From those relatives, genealogists constructed family trees using publicly available historical records. The investigation gradually narrowed until William Earl Talbot II emerged as a potential suspect requiring independent verification. Only after detectives lawfully obtained a discarded DNA sample associated with Talbot did the direct forensic comparison occur. That comparison, prosecutors argued, linked him to the biological evidence preserved since 1987. By separating genealogy from the ultimate forensic identification, prosecutors demonstrated how the investigation respected established evidentiary standards while benefiting from modern scientific innovation. Defense attorneys challenged key aspects of the prosecution's case. As expected in any serious criminal proceeding, they questioned investigative assumptions and the interpretation of evidence. They examined the reliability of witness recollections after decades had passed. They scrutinized forensic procedures. They argued alternative interpretations where they believed reasonable doubt might exist. Such challenges represented an ordinary and essential part of the adversarial legal system. The burden of proof remained entirely with the prosecution. Jurors, not investigators, scientists, or media commentators, would determine whether the evidence established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Throughout the trial, the victims' families sat through testimony describing events they had spent decades trying to understand. Court proceedings often require factual precision that can feel emotionally overwhelming. Autopsy findings, crime scene descriptions, forensic analysis, photographic evidence. Every presentation reminded relatives of the violence that had permanently altered their lives. Yet many family members also described a profound sense of relief. For the first time since 1987, the case was moving toward resolution inside a courtroom rather than remaining confined to unanswered questions. Outside the courthouse, public attention intensified. Journalists covering the proceedings recognized the historical importance of the trial. This was not simply another homicide prosecution. It represented one of the most prominent criminal cases supported by investigative genetic genealogy. Legal scholars watched carefully. Scientists followed every development. Law enforcement agencies across North America monitored the proceedings because the outcome could influence future investigations involving decades-old cold cases. The broader implications extended well beyond Washington state. If preserved DNA, combined with genealogy, could withstand judicial scrutiny in this case, investigators elsewhere might finally possess a practical roadmap for solving countless other violent crimes. Public discussion expanded rapidly. Supporters of the investigative methods emphasized the extraordinary opportunity to identify offenders who had escaped justice for decades. Families of victims from unrelated cold cases expressed renewed optimism. Police departments began reviewing evidence inventories with fresh urgency. At the same time, privacy advocates continued debating the ethical boundaries surrounding genealogy databases and law enforcement access. Those conversations continued independently of the courtroom, reflecting broader societal questions about technology, privacy, and criminal justice. Inside the courtroom, however, jurors focused on one specific question. Did the evidence presented establish responsibility for the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg? After weeks of testimony, scientific explanations, documentary evidence, and legal argument, the case moved toward deliberation. Jurors withdrew to consider everything they had heard. They examined exhibits, reviewed testimony, discussed forensic conclusions, applied legal instructions provided by the court. No dramatic television-style confrontation followed. Real criminal trials rarely unfold that way. Instead, the decision emerged through careful discussion of evidence accumulated over more than 3 decades. Ultimately, the jury returned its verdict. William Earl Talbot Zedint was found guilty of the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. For the victims' families, the moment carried emotional complexity difficult to capture with simple words. There was relief. There was grief. There was gratitude toward generations of investigators who refused to let the case disappear. There was also the painful recognition that justice, however meaningful, could never restore the lives taken in November 1987. The verdict represented accountability, not healing, not replacement, not closure in the complete sense often suggested by headlines. The empty chairs at family gatherings remained empty. The birthdays that never happened remained lost forever. The conviction answered who. It could never answer why with complete certainty. Following the verdict, the court imposed consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, reflecting the seriousness of the crimes under applicable law. For investigators, sentencing marked the formal conclusion of one of Washington's longest-running homicide investigations. For forensic science, however, the case marked a beginning rather than an ending. The successful use of investigative genetic genealogy demonstrated how preserved biological evidence could bridge decades separating violent crimes from eventual accountability. Evidence once considered scientifically exhausted had acquired entirely new investigative value. Cold case units throughout the United States and beyond began expanding partnerships with forensic genealogists. Laboratories re-examined evidence stored for decades. Investigators reopened files previously considered impossible to solve. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg case became part of a broader transformation within modern criminal investigation. Yet beneath every discussion of technology remained to young people whose ordinary trip across an international border never ended. Jay Cook, 20 years old. Tanya Van Cuylenborg, 18. Their names appeared repeatedly throughout the trial, reminding everyone that scientific innovation mattered only because 2 families had spent decades waiting for answers. Detectives often describe homicide investigations as promises made to victims. Promises that someone will continue asking questions even after public attention fades. Promises that evidence will be protected. Promises that time itself will not determine whether justice remains possible. In this case, those promises endured through changing generations of investigators, remarkable advances in forensic science, and more than 30 years of uncertainty. The courtroom proceedings confirmed something many cold case detectives had believed all along. Evidence does not forget. It waits. Sometimes patiently. Sometimes silently. But when preserved with care and revisited with better science, it can speak across decades with a clarity stronger than memory itself, ensuring that history records not only the terrible crimes committed in November 1987, but also the extraordinary determination that finally brought one of the Pacific Northwest's most enduring cold cases to justice. The verdict marked the end of the criminal trial, but it did not mark the end of the story in many ways. It marked the beginning of a broader conversation, one that reached far beyond the courtroom where justice had finally been delivered. For more than 30 years, the murders of Jay Cook and Taneja Van Cuylenborg had represented one of the Pacific Northwest's most haunting cold cases. Now, they represented something entirely different, proof that time was no longer the greatest ally of violent offenders. The conviction demonstrated that evidence carefully preserved in 1987 could survive long enough to meet scientific methods that did not yet exist when the crime occurred. It was a reminder that a cold case is not a dead case. Sometimes it is simply a case waiting for the future. The investigation quickly became the focus of law enforcement agencies throughout North America. Cold case detectives studied every stage of the inquiry. How had investigators preserved the evidence? What laboratory procedures proved decisive? How had forensic genealogists narrowed thousands of potential relatives into one suspect? Every detail mattered because hundreds of unsolved homicide investigations shared one critical feature with the Cook and Van Cuylenborg case. They still possessed biological evidence. For years, those samples had been viewed as frustrating reminders of investigations that had stalled. Now they became opportunities. Police departments across the United States began reviewing aging evidence inventories. Boxes untouched for decades were reopened. Evidence technicians verified storage conditions. Detectives re-examined files dating back to the 1970s and 1980s. Many agencies established specialized cold case units devoted entirely to investigations once considered beyond resolution. Scientific progress had fundamentally changed what unsolved meant. The impact reached forensic laboratories as well. Scientists who had spent careers improving DNA analysis suddenly found themselves working alongside an entirely new profession: forensic genealogy. Unlike traditional criminal investigators, genealogists specialized in family history. They understood historical records, migration patterns, marriage records, census documents, birth certificates. They reconstructed generations instead of crime scenes. Together, detectives and genealogists formed investigative partnerships unlike anything seen in previous decades. One discipline identified biological relationships. The other transformed those relationships into criminal investigations. Neither could achieve the same results alone. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation illustrated that collaboration with remarkable clarity. Without preserved DNA, genealogy would have been impossible. Without genealogy, the DNA profile may have remained anonymous indefinitely. Without traditional detective work, the genealogy would never have developed into a prosecutable criminal case. Each element depended upon the others. For the victims' families, however, the broader significance of forensic science remained secondary. Their attention remained fixed on Jay and Taneja. Media interviews following the conviction often reflected this perspective. Relatives spoke about the young couple's personalities rather than laboratory procedures. Jay's willingness to help others. Taneja's kindness. Their plans for the future. The ordinary moments that disappeared forever during a single weekend in November 1987. They reminded audiences that the case was never simply about scientific innovation. It was about two lives interrupted by violence. No technological breakthrough could restore what had been lost. Many family members also acknowledged the extraordinary persistence shown by investigators over 3 decades. Cold case work rarely receives sustained public attention. Detectives often spend years pursuing leads that produce nothing. They revisit evidence repeatedly, knowing that most reviews uncover no dramatic discoveries. Progress can take months, sometimes years, sometimes an entire career. The officers who originally responded to the murders in 1987 could not have known whether the case would ever be solved. Many retired before the arrest occurred. Some died without witnessing the outcome. Yet their work remained essential. The careful documentation completed during those first days. The preservation of biological evidence. The disciplined collection of forensic material. Every decision made under difficult circumstances became part of the eventual solution. Justice belonged not only to the investigators who identified the suspect, but also to those who ensured future investigators would inherit evidence capable of speaking decades later. Legal scholars also examined the case carefully. The successful prosecution demonstrated how Cortez could evaluate emerging forensic techniques while maintaining traditional evidentiary standards. Genetic genealogy itself did not replace criminal investigation. It generated leads. Those leads required confirmation through independently obtained evidence. That distinction became increasingly important as more agencies considered adopting similar methods. Cortez continued emphasizing that every investigation must respect constitutional protections, evidentiary rules, and established legal procedures. Scientific innovation could strengthen investigations. It could not eliminate the fundamental principles governing criminal justice. Outside legal circles, public fascination with genealogy expanded dramatically. Millions of people had previously submitted DNA samples hoping to learn about family origins. Few imagined their participation might someday contribute indirectly to solving violent crimes committed decades earlier. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation encouraged broader public awareness of how genealogy databases could intersect with criminal investigations under specific circumstances. The conversations proved complex. Supporters viewed the technology as a powerful instrument for justice. Critics continued raising questions concerning privacy, consent, and the future expansion of investigative methods. Those debates remain ongoing. The case did not resolve every ethical question. It did demonstrate what the technology could accomplish when combined with careful investigative practice. For detectives working unrelated cold cases, the psychological impact proved profound. Many described renewed optimism. For years, experienced investigators had watched homicide files accumulate despite determined efforts to solve them. Every unsolved murder represented unfinished work. Every unidentified offender represented unanswered questions. The conviction in this case suggested that patience, evidence preservation, and scientific progress could eventually overcome obstacles once considered permanent. Hope returned to evidence rooms across the country. Families noticed the change as well. Organizations supporting victims of unsolved violent crime reported increased interest from relatives asking whether their loved ones' investigations might also benefit from modern DNA analysis. Some contacted detectives for updates after years without meaningful communication. Others encouraged police departments to review preserved evidence. Not every case possessed usable biological material. Not every investigation could benefit from genealogy. But the perception of possibility had fundamentally changed. The phrase cold case no longer implied inevitable failure. It increasingly suggested unfinished investigation. Media coverage often focused on dramatic headlines. 31 years later, DNA solves mystery. Cold case cracked. Behind those headlines, however, investigators emphasized a quieter truth. This outcome required extraordinary patience. Nothing about the investigation happened overnight. Evidence preservation, forensic development, genealogical research, laboratory analysis, traditional detective work, legal preparation, court proceedings. Every stage demanded meticulous attention extending over decades. The breakthrough appeared sudden only because the public witnessed the final chapter rather than the entire journey. The story also reinforced another lesson familiar to experienced investigators. Technology alone does not solve crimes. People do. Scientists preserving evidence. Crime scene technicians documenting every detail. Laboratory analysts maintaining rigorous standards. Genealogists constructing accurate family histories. Detectives verifying each investigative lead. Prosecutors carefully presenting evidence. Judges ensuring fair legal proceedings. Jurors evaluating facts objectively. Justice emerges through the combined efforts of countless individuals, many working quietly beyond public recognition. The murders of Jay Cook and Taneja Van Cuylenborg ultimately transformed from an unsolved mystery into a landmark investigation, not because one revolutionary tool replaced everything else, but because every participant contributed to a process spanning more than 30 years. As investigators reflected upon the completed case, another realization emerged. The preserved biological evidence had remained unchanged since 1987. Science changed. Investigators changed. The world changed. The evidence itself simply waited. That waiting became the defining characteristic of many successful cold case investigations. Answers often exist long before anyone possesses the ability to recognize them. Evidence collected decades earlier may contain information impossible to interpret using contemporary methods. Future generations inherit not only the evidence itself, but opportunities unavailable to those who first collected it. This understanding has profoundly influenced modern homicide investigations. Today, detectives frequently preserve evidence with future scientific advances in mind. Procedures emphasize long-term storage, detailed documentation, careful chain of custody records. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation stands as one example of why those practices matter. No investigator can accurately predict what forensic laboratories will accomplish 20 or 30 years from now. Evidence preserved today may answer questions tomorrow that cannot yet even be asked. For the families, the years of uncertainty had finally ended. Grief remained. Loss remained. The absence created in November 1987 remained permanent. But one burden disappeared. The uncertainty. They no longer wondered whether someone would ever be held accountable. The legal system had spoken. History had recorded the outcome. The names of Jay Cook and Taneja Van Cuylenborg would forever be remembered not only as victims of a brutal double homicide, but also as central figures in an investigation that helped demonstrate how perseverance, careful evidence preservation, and evolving forensic science could reshape the future of cold case investigations around the world. Their story became more than a historical crime. It became a lasting reminder that while time may fade memories, weather crime scenes, and retire investigators, it cannot erase truth preserved patiently within the evidence itself, waiting for the moment when science finally learns how to reveal it. Long after the courtroom emptied and the headlines began to fade, the case continued to leave a lasting imprint on modern criminal investigation. For detectives who had spent years working unsolved homicides, the murders of Jay Cook and Taneja Van Cuylenborg became more than a successful prosecution. They became a lesson in patience, discipline, and the unpredictable evolution of forensic science. Every major investigation leaves behind procedures, experiences, and hard-earned knowledge that shape the next generation of detectives. This case did exactly that. It demonstrated that evidence collected with care could outlive the limitations of the era in which it was found. It also reminded investigators that every unsolved homicide deserves the same meticulous attention as a fresh crime scene because no one can predict what future technology will reveal. One of the most remarkable aspects of the investigation was not the arrest itself. It was the decision made decades earlier to preserve evidence that scientists could not yet fully interpret. In 1987, DNA profiling was still in its infancy. Investigators could not have imagined forensic genealogy. Commercial ancestry databases did not exist. Powerful DNA sequencing techniques remained years away. Yet experienced detectives understood one timeless principle. Never assume today's scientific limits will remain tomorrow's. That philosophy became one of the investigation's greatest strengths. Evidence was cataloged carefully. Biological samples remained protected. Documentation remained complete. As years passed, those decisions quietly transformed into the foundation upon which the entire case would eventually stand. Police academies and homicide training programs later cited similar cold case investigations while teaching evidence preservation. Young detectives entering law enforcement learned that every crime scene must be documented as though future investigators may someday revisit every photograph, every measurement, every laboratory submission. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation illustrated why. A seemingly insignificant biological sample collected in 1987 ultimately became the most important witness in the case. Unlike human memory, DNA did not fade. It did not become confused. It did not forget. It remained exactly as investigators found it. The only thing that changed was humanity's ability to understand what it contained. The case also highlighted another reality often overlooked by the public. Cold case investigations rarely move in straight lines. Progress comes through cycles. A new forensic method appears. Evidence is re-examined. Fresh leads emerge. Months of work follow. Sometimes those leads disappear completely. Other times, they reshape the entire investigation. Detectives assigned to cold cases learn to accept uncertainty as part of the profession. Most investigative efforts produce no dramatic breakthroughs. Success often depends upon persistence rather than speed. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg followed that pattern almost perfectly. Decades of frustration preceded one extraordinary breakthrough. The genealogy component of the investigation also demonstrated the importance of multidisciplinary cooperation. Traditional homicide detectives understood criminal behavior. Forensic scientists understood biological evidence. Genealogists understood family history. Legal experts ensured investigative methods complied with constitutional and evidentiary standards. No single profession solved the case independently. It required collaboration. That model has increasingly become standard practice in complex cold case investigations. Modern law enforcement agencies frequently assemble teams composed of investigators, forensic analysts, genealogists, prosecutors, and digital specialists. Each contributes expertise unavailable to the others. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation helped demonstrate why that approach can succeed. Public understanding of forensic science also evolved because of cases like this. Television often portrays criminal investigations as rapid sequences of dramatic discoveries. Real investigations are different. Laboratory testing requires time. Evidence review requires patience. Genealogical research can involve thousands of historical records spanning centuries. Detectives repeatedly verify conclusions before presenting them publicly. The years separating the murders from the eventual arrest reflected not investigative failure, but the reality that science itself required time to develop. No amount of determination in 1987 could have produced forensic genealogy. The necessary technology simply did not yet exist. This distinction matters. Cold case investigators frequently receive criticism for investigations appearing stagnant. In reality, many cases remain unsolved because available scientific tools cannot yet answer the questions evidence presents. When technology advances, entirely new investigative possibilities emerge. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation stands among the clearest examples of that principle. The broader law enforcement community responded accordingly. Evidence storage practices received renewed attention. Police departments invested in improved preservation methods. Laboratories expanded cold case testing programs. Federal, state, and local agencies increased collaboration on long unsolved violent crimes. Funding became available for specialized cold case units in jurisdictions that previously lacked dedicated investigators. Scientific progress encouraged institutional change. The influence extended internationally as well. Law enforcement agencies outside the United States closely followed developments in forensic genealogy. Countries with different legal systems examined whether similar techniques might be adapted within their own judicial frameworks. Researchers published studies evaluating investigative methods. Conferences devoted entire sessions to genealogy-based investigations. What began as one homicide case gradually contributed to global discussions about the future of forensic science. At the same time, ethical debates continued. Privacy advocates questioned how genetic information should be used. Legal scholars examined constitutional considerations. Genealogy companies refined policies governing law enforcement access. Cortez evaluated emerging legal questions as additional investigations reached trial. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg case became part of those discussions not because it answered every question, but because it illustrated both the extraordinary benefits and the important responsibilities accompanying powerful new investigative tools. For the detectives involved, however, the case remained deeply personal. Many later reflected upon the emotional experience of finally identifying a suspect after decades of uncertainty. Cold case work demands unusual resilience. Investigators often devote years to cases producing little visible progress. Victims' families continue asking questions. Public attention fades. Resources shift toward newer investigations. Still, detectives continue reviewing evidence because experience teaches them that impossible cases sometimes become solvable overnight when science changes. This investigation rewarded that persistence. One recurring theme appeared in interviews with investigators following the conviction. Respect. Respect for the original detectives who collected evidence correctly. Respect for laboratory personnel who maintained scientific standards. Respect for prosecutors who carefully presented complicated forensic concepts to juries. Respect for the families whose patience exceeded 3 decades. Cold case investigations are cumulative. Each generation builds upon the work completed by those before it. No individual investigator solved the murders alone. The solution belonged collectively to everyone who refused to let the evidence disappear. The families also continued honoring Jay Cook and Taneja van Cuylenborg in ways extending beyond the courtroom. Public remembrance focused increasingly on their lives rather than solely on the violence that ended them. Friends shared memories. Relatives described their personalities. Communities reflected upon the extraordinary kindness shown by strangers who supported the families throughout decades of uncertainty. Such remembrance carries particular importance in homicide cases. Victims deserve recognition for who they were, not merely for the crimes committed against them. Jay and Taneja were remembered as young people with ambitions, relationships, and futures that should have unfolded naturally. The investigation ensured those futures were never forgotten, even though they could never be restored. Perhaps the most enduring lesson emerging from the case concerns time itself. Violent offenders often believe passing years weaken investigations. Witnesses age. Memories fade. Detectives retire. Evidence appears forgotten. Historically, those assumptions sometimes proved correct. Modern forensic science has changed that calculation. Today, preserved biological evidence may become stronger over time as analytical methods improve. Technology increasingly favors careful evidence preservation over criminal concealment. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation demonstrated this transformation with remarkable clarity. The offender escaped identification for decades. The evidence did not. It waited, patiently, silently, until science finally reached it. As cold case investigators continue reopening files across North America, the influence of this investigation remains unmistakable. Thousands of preserved evidence boxes still occupy secure storage facilities. Each contains unanswered questions. Some may never produce identifiable suspects. Others may already contain everything necessary for resolution, waiting only for future scientific advances. No detective can predict which investigation will become tomorrow's breakthrough. That uncertainty fuels persistence. The murders of Jay Cook and Taneja van Cuylenborg ultimately became far more than a solved cold case. They became a reminder that justice sometimes travels at the speed of science. Slowly, methodically, across generations. But when evidence is preserved with care and investigators refuse to surrender, even the longest silence can eventually be broken, allowing truth to emerge from history and reminding the world that while killers may hide, the evidence they leave behind can continue searching for them long after they believe the trail has disappeared forever. The story of Jay Cook and Taneja van Cuylenborg did not begin with DNA. It began in an era when homicide detectives relied almost entirely on witness statements, fingerprints, blood typing, shoe impressions, fibers, handwritten notes, and instinct sharpened through years of experience. In November 1987, forensic science stood on the edge of a revolution, but few investigators could see it coming. The evidence collected from the crime scenes represented enormous investigative value, yet much of its true potential remained locked away, waiting for technology that had not yet been invented. The detectives working the case could preserve the biological evidence, document its origin, and secure it inside carefully labeled containers. What they could not do was ask the questions that modern laboratories would eventually answer. In many ways, the evidence was ahead of its time, carrying information science was not yet capable of reading. During the 1980s, DNA profiling was only beginning to emerge as a practical forensic tool. The earliest methods required relatively large, well-preserved biological samples and involved labor-intensive laboratory procedures. Testing often took weeks or months, and the techniques available were far less sensitive than those used decades later. Most police departments had limited access to specialized laboratories capable of conducting DNA analysis, and many investigators still depended primarily on conventional forensic disciplines. Fingerprints remained the gold standard for personal identification. Blood group analysis could exclude suspects but rarely identify them with certainty. Hair comparison, fiber examination, and microscopic trace evidence all contributed valuable information, yet each possessed limitations that investigators understood all too well. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg unfolded during this transitional period. Detectives recognized the importance of preserving biological evidence. They simply could not foresee how dramatically forensic science would evolve. That foresight, whether born from experience, caution, or professional discipline, ultimately became one of the investigation's greatest strengths. Evidence that seemed scientifically incomplete in 1987 remained available for future generations. As the 1990s progressed, DNA profiling underwent extraordinary transformation. Polymerase chain reaction, commonly known as PCR, revolutionized forensic biology by allowing scientists to amplify tiny quantities of DNA into amounts suitable for analysis. Learn more. Instead of requiring large biological samples, laboratories could now develop profiles from significantly smaller amounts of genetic material. Cases previously considered impossible suddenly became testable. Old evidence recovered from decades-old investigations gained entirely new value. Scientists improved extraction methods, contamination controls, and statistical analysis. Every year, laboratory capabilities expanded. Law enforcement agencies soon recognized another opportunity. If DNA profiles from convicted offenders could be stored inside searchable databases, investigators might identify suspects by comparing biological evidence recovered from crime scenes against known offenders. This concept led to the creation and expansion of national DNA databases. In the United States, the Combined DNA Index System, better known as CODIS, allowed participating laboratories to compare forensic DNA profiles with profiles collected from qualifying offenders and other forensic evidence. The impact proved revolutionary. Countless violent crimes were solved through direct DNA matches. Serial offenders operating across multiple jurisdictions were identified. Individuals wrongfully suspected of crimes were excluded with scientific certainty. Yet for detectives investigating the Cook and Van Cuylenborg murders, one frustrating obstacle remained. The unknown DNA profile recovered from the evidence produced no database match. Not in the 1990s. Not as CODIS expanded. Not after additional offenders entered the system. Again and again, laboratories compared the profile. Again and again, no identification emerged. The evidence clearly belonged to someone. That someone simply had no qualifying DNA profile inside the criminal database. For many investigations, that result would have represented another dead end. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg case became one of thousands waiting for another scientific breakthrough. That breakthrough arrived from an unexpected direction. It did not originate within forensic laboratories. It emerged from genealogy. During the early 21st century, millions of people around the world began submitting DNA samples to commercial ancestry services. Their motivations were deeply personal, and some wanted to discover ancestral origins. Others hoped to locate distant relatives. Many simply felt curious about family history stretching across generations. Each submitted sample became part of a growing network of genetic relationships. Initially, few imagined these databases might someday influence criminal investigations. The science behind genealogy differed fundamentally from traditional forensic identification. Criminal DNA databases searched for exact matches. Genealogy searched for relatives. Even distant cousins share measurable portions of DNA inherited from common ancestors. Instead of asking whether two DNA profiles belong to the same individual, genealogists asked whether two people might share grandparents, great-grandparents, or earlier family connections. This distinction transformed investigative possibilities. An unknown offender no longer needed to appear personally inside a database. A distant cousin might provide the first clue. Professional genealogists then reconstructed extensive family trees using publicly available historical records. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, military records, census documents, newspaper archives, property records. One verified relationship led to another. Branches expanded. Generations connected. The process resembled assembling an enormous historical puzzle where each documented family relationship narrowed the field of possibilities. Unlike fictional crime dramas, genealogy investigations rarely proceed quickly. Weeks become months. Months sometimes become years. Researchers verify every relationship before drawing conclusions. Mistakes can affect entire family trees. Accuracy remains essential. Eventually, multiple family branches intersect around one individual whose age, location, and historical circumstances fit the investigation. That person becomes an investigative, not a convicted offender. Traditional police work then resumes. Detectives verify facts. Review historical records. Establish opportunity. Obtain independent DNA for direct comparison whenever legally appropriate. Only then does the investigation move toward arrest. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg case followed exactly this progression. The preserved DNA profile entered genealogical analysis. Family relationships gradually emerged. Historical research narrowed possibilities. William Earl Talbot Visit-Checking became the focus of investigative attention. Detectives independently obtained a discarded DNA sample associated with him. Laboratory scientists compared that sample with the biological evidence preserved since 1987. The direct forensic match followed. That comparison, not genealogy alone, became the cornerstone of the criminal prosecution. The distinction remains critically important. Genetic genealogy functions as an investigative roadmap. Traditional forensic DNA supplies the evidentiary confirmation. Together, they represent one of the most significant advances in modern criminal investigation. Separately, neither would have produced the same result. The success of this investigation reshaped priorities inside law enforcement agencies worldwide. Evidence preservation became even more rigorous. Cold case units expanded. Forensic laboratories invested in improved testing capabilities. Police departments reviewed unsolved homicide files dating back decades. Cases once considered impossible suddenly appeared solvable. Detectives recognized that evidence collected years earlier might already contain everything necessary for future resolution. The only missing ingredient was scientific progress. Universities also increased research into forensic genealogy. Training programs developed specialized curricula. Professional standards evolved rapidly. Investigators learned not only how to interpret genetic relationships, but also how to navigate the legal and ethical responsibilities accompanying such powerful technology. Privacy concerns became an essential part of the discussion. Genealogy databases established policies governing law enforcement access. Cortez examined constitutional questions surrounding investigative methods. Public debate continued. Supporters emphasized justice for victims and families. Critics highlighted concerns regarding genetic privacy and informed consent. These discussions remain ongoing today. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation became one of several landmark cases informing that debate. Its significance extended beyond one courtroom. It influenced policy, scientific research, law enforcement training, public understanding. Perhaps most importantly, it transformed expectations surrounding cold cases themselves. For decades, investigators often described certain murders as unsolvable. Modern forensic science has fundamentally altered that perception. Today, detectives rarely declare a biologically supported homicide impossible. Instead, they ask different questions. Has every available forensic method been applied? Can preserved evidence benefit from newer technology? Will future scientific advances reveal information unavailable today? These questions reflect a profound shift in investigative philosophy. Evidence is no longer judged solely by current capabilities. It is evaluated according to future potential. The investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Taneja Van Cuylenborg stands as one of the clearest demonstrations of that principle. A biological sample collected during a cold November investigation remained silent for more than 30 years. It crossed generations of detectives. It survived changing laboratory techniques. It waded through scientific revolutions. Then, when technology finally matured enough to understand it, that same evidence accomplished what no interview, no witness statement, and no traditional investigative strategy had managed to achieve. It identified the man investigators had searched for since 1987. The evolution of DNA profiling and genetic genealogy did more than solve a cold case. It redefined the relationship between time and justice. For decades, offenders believed history worked in their favor. Witnesses forgot. Evidence deteriorated. Investigators retired. Today, history increasingly favors the evidence instead. As science continues advancing, every preserved biological sample carries the possibility that tomorrow's laboratory may answer questions today's technology cannot yet ask. That realization has permanently changed homicide investigation. It has given renewed hope to families waiting beside evidence rooms filled with carefully preserved memories. And it has ensured that even the oldest cold cases are no longer measured solely by the years that have passed, but by the scientific possibilities that still lie ahead. The conviction of William Earl Talbot II closed one chapter of the investigation, but it opened another that continues to shape criminal justice around the world. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg are now studied not only because they were solved after more than 3 decades, but because they illustrate how forensic science evolves through patience, innovation, and the willingness of investigators to preserve evidence for a future they cannot yet imagine. Every successful cold case solved through DNA reinforces the same lesson. Scientific progress rarely arrives in one dramatic leap. Instead, it develops through thousands of incremental improvements made by researchers, laboratory scientists, engineers, statisticians, and investigators working across generations. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg case became one of the clearest demonstrations of how those gradual advances can eventually converge into a single breakthrough capable of rewriting history. The earliest forms of forensic DNA analysis were remarkably different from the techniques used today. Laboratories depended upon methods requiring relatively large, well-preserved biological samples. Testing consumed considerable time. Interpretation often involved complex manual procedures. Results were valuable but limited by the technology available. Scientists understood that DNA contained extraordinary identifying power. The challenge lay in extracting that information accurately and consistently. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, laboratory methods improved at an extraordinary pace. PCR amplification became faster and more reliable. Short tandem repeat analysis, commonly known as A-to profiling, gradually became the international forensic standard because it allowed scientists to compare highly variable regions of human DNA with remarkable accuracy. Instead of relying upon broad biological characteristics, laboratories generated numerical genetic profiles capable of distinguishing one individual from billions of others. Each improvement expanded the practical value of preserved evidence. Samples once considered too small suddenly became suitable for analysis. Degraded biological material recovered from older investigations often produced usable genetic information for the first time. Cold case detectives watched these developments carefully. Many understood that evidence stored years earlier might eventually become the key to solving investigations that had resisted every traditional approach. Yet even as laboratory science advanced, one significant limitation remained. DNA could identify someone only if investigators had another profile available for comparison. Criminal databases expanded rapidly, but they remained incomplete by design. Only individuals whose DNA had been lawfully collected under applicable statutes appeared within those systems. If an offender had never entered the qualifying database, no match would appear regardless of how accurate the forensic profile became. This limitation frustrated investigators across countless cold cases. The science worked. The databases simply lacked the individual they sought. The emergence of consumer genealogy fundamentally altered that landscape. Millions of individuals voluntarily submitted DNA samples to learn about ancestry, ethnic origins, and extended family connections. Unlike forensic databases, genealogy services focused on biological relationships rather than criminal identification. Their purpose was entirely different. Users hoped to discover cousins, trace migration patterns, or better understand family history stretching across generations. As participation increased, these databases evolved into extraordinary collections of human genetic relationships. The significance for criminal investigation emerged gradually. Researchers recognized that even distant relatives share measurable portions of inherited DNA. An unknown offender might never appear inside a genealogy database. A third cousin might. A fourth cousin might. Those distant relationships could provide investigators with entirely new investigative pathways. Instead of searching directly for one person, genealogists searched for the person's extended family. This approach required specialized expertise extending far beyond traditional detective work. Professional genealogists reconstructed family histories using historical records accumulated over centuries. Birth registrations, marriage records, death certificates, military enlistment documents, church archives, immigration records, census data, land ownership documents, obituaries. Each verified relationship connected another branch of an expanding family tree. The process demanded extraordinary patience. Researchers frequently analyzed thousands of historical records before narrowing an investigation toward a manageable number of possible individuals. Importantly, genealogy never replaced conventional investigation. It supplemented it. Once genealogical research identified a likely candidate, detectives returned to familiar investigative methods.